You may have forgotten, but way back in 1994, we published an article that you had written for the Times Literary Supplement on Afrocentrism.
Oh, yes.
This was an old issue of Skeptic when we had first started in '92, and I bumped into Afrocentrism.
Yes.
And, and so we had something by Mary Lefkowitz, who described it as, a pseudo-history, kind of an analog to pseudoscience, which we deal a lot with in Skeptic.
Right.
But I haven't really seen come across my radar in must be 10, 15 years, this whole issue of what race were the Egyptians? Was Cleopatra black? And those kinds of questions. That whole thing just seems to have faded, or have I just missed it?
I think it's like many things in the moment which have disappeared into recesses in the internet. So I think there's a world of people who are still pursuing those thoughts, but they don't have the same salience in the world in general that they may have had for a while. That's my impression.
Yeah.
Because I don't hear much about it either. I mean, occasionally people complain to me about what I said all those years ago, but I mean, in the case of Cleopatra, it's really so clear that she was of Macedonian ancestry that it's a bit odd that anyone thinks anything else. I mean, she was put there by, her family were put there by Alexander the Great. So I don't think in that case there's much doubt about it. But yeah, I know people believe what they want to believe these days.
Well, I think it was you that made the point that even asking the question, what race or what color were the Egyptians, or what color was Cleopatra, is something a late 20th century American would ask, not an ancient Egyptian.
Yes. I mean, in fact, I was thinking about this the other day. I mean, Herodotus famously talks about the fact that the world is divided into three continents: Europe, Asia, and what he called Libya, what we would call Africa. But he's very puzzled about why, because he does. They seem to him kind of. He's puzzled both by why they all have feminine names, why are they all names of women, he says, but also by the question what this means, since he, after all, himself was born in Asia, even though he was Greek. And he traveled easily up the Nile all the way to Aswan, we think. So that idea that the world was sort of naturally divided in that way is it's an ancient one, but it's a bit strange. And they certainly wouldn't have done it in terms of color, of course, because the people on the north coast of Africa that they knew included people like the Phoenicians, who were, they were darker than Norwegians, but they weren't the same color as typical sub-Saharan Africans. Right. And just as you say, I don't think they would have framed the question that way. It wouldn't have occurred to them that was the right way to think about it.
Well, that is the theme of your book. To give it a proper introduction here, the lies that bind, rethinking identity. I take book titles seriously. I always assume that the authors think carefully about what they're calling their central thesis of the book. So it's not just an illusion of identity. You're using the word lie. Why such a strong word?
Well, because I think that one of the truths about identities is that for a variety of reasons, depending on what the identity is, people very often need to have a story about them that isn't true. In some cases, it's because the true story wouldn't allow the identity to do the work for them that it's doing. If there isn't a natural commonality to all the people in France, then you can't use French nationalism as a way to strengthen the French state,
right?
And so on. So I think maybe lies a little bit strong, because I don't mean that everybody who relies on these falsehoods knows them to be falsehoods, but I think the falsehoods are often, as I say, sort of essential to the work we want identities to do. So that one thing that happens if you challenge the untruths is that the identities have to be rethought in terms of the role they play. Mm-hmm. A long time ago in the 19th century, Ernest Renan, the great French historian who was actually conservative politically, said that history, by which he meant the study of history, the scientific study of history, is often the enemy of the nation, because the truth about the truth about the past doesn't necessarily fit with what what the people who are running the state want us to be doing.
Yeah.
And as I say, he was a French patriot. He loved France.
Right.
But he was also convinced that the stories that France told about itself needed to be correct, and that many of them weren't. And one of the other wonderful lines that from Renan is he says, nations are held together as much by what they choose to forget as by what they choose to remember.
Yeah, to that point, I was in Russia last week for this geek picnic thing. It's sort of a celebration of science, technology, robots, AI, all this stuff. Big fun, 30,000 people in Moscow. But I had an extra couple of days, so I went to the Victory Park, where they have this huge museum in honor of the people who died in the Second World War. And the first thing I noticed was they don't call it the Second World War. In Russia, it's called the Great Patriotic War.
Yes.
And they really show how much they lost and suffered, particularly relative to the Western Allies. Just staggering, just like 27 million Russians died just as casualties in the war, in addition to Stalin's purges and all that. And when we in America, we like to read about the great Desert Fox, Rommel, and the battles in Africa and so on, where they had 1, 2, 3 divisions on each side. On the Eastern Front, they had like 200 divisions on each side. The carnage is just unimaginable. Yeah. And so they really portray, what they suffered, and it's not comparable to what, American, British, French suffered in the war. The Great Patriotic War. It's like, wow, I really got that feeling that this is part of their identity, the suffering that they endured, and still they continue is become part of their national identity.
Yes.
And they had this giant room where it's sort of an artistic exhibition of chains hanging down from the ceiling, just like little ball chains, like for a keychain kind of thing. But they're like 3 feet long with a little 100 beads, and at the end of each string of beads is a little crystal teardrop. And the entire ceiling of this room, it's just overwhelming, representing the number of dead. So that has now become part of the Russian identity, I think, is the suffering, that they endured. None of us can really understand.
Right. No, they did have a terrible war, and the failure. They tried very hard, of course, to keep out of the war to begin with, and they made a deal with the Nazis, which the Nazis broke. But yes, there was enormous suffering all over Europe that I think here in the United States and also in Britain, which was protected to some extent by the Channel, even though there was a lot of bombing. I think people who didn't live through that have a very different sense of what the war was about than people who lived through the sort of horrors that happened on the Eastern Front. In the war between the Germans and the Russians. Yeah.
I don't know. And also made me think, I don't know what Hitler was thinking. Even if he'd gotten to Moscow, it's 9 time zones across all the way to the Pacific. What do you do when you get there? It's just.
Well, we're lucky that Hitler was such a bad military leader.
Yeah.
There were moments when perhaps he could have won the war in Europe. But he didn't, because he was committed to a picture of things that was false.
Yep.
And so he made serious mistakes.
So then the other thing I was thinking about in reading your book, and also just how we started this conversation, my wife is from Germany. She's from Cologne. So she's lived here now 5 years. And after about 2 years, we watch the daily news and so forth. The impression she gets of how important race is in America compared to, say, in Germany. They have other issues with the Turks or whoever, but in America, it's just so starkly black and white, and pretty much every day there's some issue about race.
Yes.
And it seems like that's become part of our national identity, this sort of racial tension.
Yes. Well, it's sort of our founding sin. The Constitution is this weird document because, on the one hand, as first promulgated, it maintains the status of slaves, and it gives representation in the Congress on the basis of counting slaves as a fraction of a person.
Right.
It also anticipated, of course, the ending of slavery, of the slave trade anyway, and the founders were constantly talking about freedom, and they understood that there was a tension, I think, between their talk of freedom and the reality of what they were doing with their black slaves. And our history starts there as an independent nation, and we've had a hard time getting out of it. We fought the bloodiest war of the 19th century in order to complete the process of getting rid of legal enslavement. And then we spent 100 years not really living up to the reality of that promise. And then we had, the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act and so on, which tried to give real legal meaning to the equality of black and white people. And then, of course, after 2 centuries of that, you have to struggle to change the social meaning. You can't just do it by changing the laws. People have to change their attitudes. And I suppose that's what we should think we're doing now. We're trying to work towards genuine social equality. And if we were to achieve social equality, I think what your wife has noticed would cease to be true. We'd be less preoccupied with racial questions. Now, one of the great divides in our country is about how much persisting racial injustice there is. And I think perhaps a majority of white people think that because we made those changes in the 60s, from Brown v. Board of Education to Loving v. Virginia, we sort of took white supremacy out of the federal legal system. They think that, and then we also did some affirmative action in the late, starting in the 60s and going on for a while. And I think many white people think, well, look, we did all that, so it's over. When you look at the statistics, I think it's hard to believe that the residual effects of racial injustice in the past have gone away. Mm-hmm. And one has to remember that at the same time that the civil rights movement was going on, the federal government was still, for example, insisting on racial segregation in public housing. Mm-hmm. And since a lot of white wealth comes from the new housing that people acquired in the 50s and 60s, which they were then able to hold on to, build up, and maintain the capital value of. One of the big explanations for the differences in wealth, not in income, but in wealth between blacks and whites, has to do, especially at the lower end of the income spectrum, has to do just with the persistence of federal racial unfairness through the 50s and 60s. So, I think my own view is that, of course, things are much better than they were. I like to remind my students that when I was born and when my parents married, they would have been breaking the law in the state of Virginia because one of them was white, one of them was black. Right. And that was true until I was a teenager. Right.
1967.
Yeah. So it's a long process. I think it's important to insist that we've made progress, that we have moved forward. I mean, there are little steps back and from time to time, but the basic thrust is in the right direction. But I think I myself think it's premature to declare that all over. And so what your wife notices on the news, I think, is a reflection of the reality that this continues to be a serious set of issues in our country.
Yeah. So, you opened the Lies That Bind, your new book, with, I forget, it was a taxi driver. Somebody was asking you who are you? What are you, I guess? Are you black, white, whatever? And it's complicated.
Yes. Well, I think so. Because of the growing rate of marriage, interracial marriages, also just international marriages more generally, the meaning of our way of dividing people is constantly being challenged
Yeah.
by the reality. So if you are an African American whose ancestors were mostly slaves, and you and you grew up in an African American community, then what it means for you to be black is different from what it means for, say, a Jamaican immigrant or a Haitian immigrant or a Dominican immigrant with dark skin, or a Cuban immigrant with dark skin, and also different what it means for people like me who grew up in Africa and come here. And so saying she's black or he's black, at least with those people, tells you a good deal less than I think people often assume.
Well, let's go through the categories you have in your book of creed, country, color, class, and culture. So 5 criteria there for how we identify ourselves or other people. So starting with creed, obviously religion's still pretty big in America, not so much in Europe, but here it very much matters what your religion is. So give us a little background on that and the history of that.
Good. So I mean, yes, in the United States, religious identities matter a lot, and they matter more, as you say, than they do, I think, in Europe today and in some other places. They matter less here than they do in some other places. In Ghana, 100% of people would claim
That's
some
true, yes.
religious affiliation, and here it's probably now, I don't know, 80% or something like that. The main points I want to make about religious identities is, first, that I think we characteristically misunderstand religious identities because we focus too much on questions of what people believe and not enough on the role of religious identities in 2 other dimensions of life, which is on what people do and think it's right to do, their practices, and also on the role of religious identities in shaping communities. So that religious identities often mean that those are the people you spend more time with. These are the people you go to synagogue with, the people you go to temple with, the people you go to church with. And, especially for those people who identify as sort of highly religious in this country. So these are people who spend quite a lot of time with their fellow members of their religious group, Mormons, for example. For them, their lives, their social lives are crucially shaped by this. And that's true independently of what other Mormons happen to believe. It's not just about, propositions. It's not just about agreeing to things people say. Now, one reason why I think we're over-invested in the idea of belief is because that's a Christian habit. Christians have been fussing about belief since the beginning, and a lot of the early fights in the Christian church are about doctrine. And the great councils of the church are about settling on the creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, and so on. And if you read them, they're surprisingly specific in what they say you're supposed to believe.
Right.
And often in ways that I think quite odd, because after all, so take the claim that in one of the classic creeds it says that Christ is of one substance with the Father. Now, substance there is a technical philosophical idea. If you're an Aristotelian, you know what it is.
Yeah.
But most Christians, for most of human history, wouldn't have known what that word meant. And yet every Sunday they were supposed to be saying that they believed this thing about Christ's substance. And not only that, but at some points in the history of the church, people got killed for having the wrong view about whether Christ was the one substance with the Father or whether there were 2 substances. So Christianity is a bit peculiar in this way. I think it's very, very focused. If you ask the great fathers, the intellectual people like Maimonides about Judaism, a lot of what they talk about when they're saying what Judaism is not about believing things, it's about doing things. And if you ask Muslims what are the central elements of Islam, well, they'll say the 5 pillars, but that includes daily prayer, which is not a matter of belief, it's a matter of doing something. It's going to Mecca if you can, that's not a matter of belief, that's a matter of doing something. And it's charity, which is, those are 3 of the 5 pillars. Right. So I think now Christians are inclined to exaggerate the significance of belief, but in fact, in their own lives, most Christians, what matters about their religion is actually not mostly belief. It's mostly, as I said, morality and the things you do with each other. So I think we have a tendency to misunderstand, even religious people who are seriously religious, I think tend to misunderstand the significance of their own religious identities. Now, one of the arguments I make in the chapter is that this leads us to make a mistake that is very damaging for relations, I think, between Christians and Muslims, which is this tendency to say, well, it's all a matter of belief, and the beliefs are in the book. So we have to look in their book, and if we find anything in their book that's bad, that shows that they're bad people, because after all, they're supposed to believe what's in their book.
Right.
Now, and so people do this with Islam all the time about women.
Right.
But look, Pakistan and Bangladesh have both had women presidents, and we haven't.
Right.
And so you've got to be careful in interpreting. And I mentioned them, of course, because they are constitutionally Muslim states. They're states which are Muslim by their constitution. So I think all we have to do is think about our own case. So I was raised a Christian. I know that no Christian I've ever met is in favor of stoning adulterers to death. Right. Well, it does say in the Torah that, which is for Christians is the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch part of the Old Testament. It does say in there that you should do that. Now, I'm well aware that your Christian listeners, I don't know how many of those you have,
not that many, but
will complain that I've missed the fact that Jesus says something about adultery, which he does. But what he doesn't say, I reject the law of Moses.
Right.
He does not say that. What he says is, if you have no sins, you can start throwing stones.
Right. Right.
Notice that he then doesn't throw a stone himself. And he's without sin. He's the only person that ever has been.
Right.
So a reasonable Christian might infer from that Christ didn't think that people should do that. But so I'm not saying that Christians should think that stones should be thrown as adulterous. I'm just saying that it does say so in the book that they say they believe it.
Yep. And homosexuals too.
And homosexuals should be put to death as well. And again, so if you think that that's what the book says, then you'll be completely perplexed by the fact that the American branch of the Anglican Communion, the Episcopalian Church, allows gay priests and bishops and marriages. You'll think, how could that be? Well, the answer is they're just like everybody else. They reinterpret their traditions as they go along to fit their developing moral understanding.
Right.
And if they can do that, why can't Muslims?
So these are very fluid categories, creed being part of our identity. Changes over time. The Episcopalians have always been kind of on the cutting edge of the moral arc, as have the Quakers with regard to the abolition of slavery. So when I do debates with theists now, they hold up Bishop Wilberforce and say, look, the Quakers and Wilberforce, they were leading Christians against the slave trade. Yeah, but their opponents were all their fellow Christians who held up the Bible that said, look, slavery is endorsed right here in the Great Book.
Yes. I think it's actually, not to be unnecessarily provocative, I think it's actually easier to defend the view that tolerance, at the very least, for homosexuals is biblically groundable than it is to hold the view that anti-slavery is biblically groundable, because slavery is so pervasive in the Old and the New Testament. St. Paul instructs slaves to obey their masters, even if they're cruel, he says. So I think actually slavery has a better textual foundation than anti-gay stuff. Making that argument depends upon detailed things, some of which are in the book, about how to look at those passages in the Bible. But my point is only that I think what we have to see that what's doing the work here isn't just the text. And so the idea that the text fixes what's going on is a deep mistake. And it's a deep mistake about Christianity. It's a deep mistake about Islam. It's a deep mistake about Judaism. Think about how many contemporary Jews identify as Jewish, but eat lobster, which is clearly not allowed according to the Torah, or do one of 100 things that the Torah says you mustn't do. And we could go further and say, if we looked into it, the same is true about Hinduism, about Buddhism. It's not just a point about the Abrahamic religions. In all of these cases, there's a mixture of belief and community and practice, and you can never predict what the practice will be just by looking at the beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
You have to look at the practices themselves.
That's right. Yeah, so like pollsters don't even ask, what is your opinion on interracial marriage anymore, because it's not even a public issue. And I suspect the issue of gay marriage, they won't even be asking that question anymore in 5 years or so. It'll just be a non-issue. I'm not sure the racial issues will go away quite so quickly. You and I are the same age, and I was born in '54. You're a few months older than me, so you're the wise one here. But I've kind of always been a fan and follower of Dr. Martin Luther King. I wrote a book called The Moral Arc. And, judging people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Okay, so that's 1960s. You would think by now we would have gotten past that, like we have interracial marriage and soon gay marriage. And yet it's still there to a certain extent, particularly in the last couple of years. We've seen this return to populist nationalism, some xenophobia, tighten up the borders. And so not just here, but, in England with Brexit and a little bit in France. So I'm a little surprised about that. Maybe you're not as surprised because you follow these things a little more closely internationally than I do. Maybe, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm getting used to it. I'm sad about it. I wish that we were moving in a different direction on these things, and I think it's worth trying to think about why these things are going on. Clearly, sometimes people say that, well, people reach for these forms of ethnic identification when they're under economic pressure. I don't think that's a very good account of what's going on in the United States, because we have actually at the moment very low unemployment rates. Mm-hmm. It's true that the objective material conditions for the vast majority of people in the bottom half of the income distribution have not been improving. In fact, they got worse, of course, in 2008, and they've come back to some extent. But over the last couple of decades, we haven't done very much to share the enormous growth in American wealth very evenly. Mm-hmm. It's mostly gone to people in the top 20%, and within the top 20%, it's significantly gone to people in the top 1 and then 0.1%. Right. And so I agree that people's economic circumstances are not improving, but they're not really. And we should accept that there are people, there are families in the United States today where the children go to bed hungry, which is astonishing in a country as rich as ours. So I'm not saying there aren't genuine problems with poverty, but if you look to see who shifted their votes, for example, to support the populism of President Trump, it doesn't look like it was the poorest people particularly.
No, and in fact, 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump.
Yes.
Clearly, they're not voting their religion there; they're voting their political party.
Yes. Well, I think so. If I knew how to deal with it theoretically, I would have had a chapter on political identities. But I find it very hard. I mean, we've become. I talk about sort of the fact that we're sort of tribalistic in the first chapter. We've got a kind of political tribalism in the United States today. So people are tribally Republican. What that means is they side with other Republicans more or less independently of what they're arguing for. So 10 years ago, in fact, 5 years ago, in fact, before President Trump came along, the typical position of the Republicans on trade was very pro-trade. And the typical position on Russia was that Russia was one of our enemies.
Right.
Donald Trump, for various reasons, doesn't think those things. And now the typical Republican seems to be willing to vote for a guy who's bad on trade and friendly to Russia. Right. So they're not supporting him because they've examined his views independently and thought about them and decided that he's right. They're supporting him because they're tribally. I'm not saying everybody, but most of them, I think, a significant proportion. And this is true about Democrats, of course. I'm a Democrat, and I'm tribally Democratic. I try not to be. I try to maintain what I think is the important point here, which is that just as black people are not all the same, and white people are not all the same, and Jews are not all the same, and Catholics are not all the same, so Democrats and Republicans are different from each other in lots of kinds of ways. And the idea that, all Republicans are racist, or all Republicans are sexist, or all Republicans are homophobic, not true.
Right.
And we need to bear that in mind. Now, it is true that the policies of the current Republican government are, in my judgment, bad for women's equality, bad for racial equality, and bad for lesbian and gay rights. But that's not because those are the aims of every Republican. And there are plenty of racist Democrats, by the way. So I think we need to draw back from our kind of instinctive tribalism about political matters as well. I think we have become more tribalistic recently. And I don't have a theory about that, but I think one reason is that actually a bunch of political leaders have been stoking tribalism. And also that we have news media that stoke tribalism of this sort. I'm not saying it's equally bad on the right and the left, but it's definitely there on both the right and the left.
You know, in his new book, Enlightenment Now, Steve Pinker makes the point that take a subject like climate change. Now, hardly anybody really knows the technical science. Liberals, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, no one knows that much about it. So if I'm going to comment on it, say on social media, all I can do is just cast my vote for my team. Now, my team, conservatives, we are pro-free market, pro-capitalism, pro-industry. And that Al Gore guy made that film about global warming, and he's a liberal. And therefore, that's become a liberal cause that's anti-business, Now, that I do know about, so I'm going to cast my vote and make a public statement about that, even if I don't know anything about climate science.
Right.
So, we need to decouple the science from the politics, but it's too late in that issue, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when people say these things about global warming, one of the things they're doing is just signaling who they are.
Right. Yeah.
Right. They don't really.
It's part of your identity thesis here, that this is my identity. I'm pro free market capitalism, so on, or I'm religious, so that evolution thing can't be true, and so on, whatever it is, and that's right. So they're just signaling, virtue signaling, we call it.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I think it's, if you ask how can we get out of this mess, obviously, well, not obviously. I think it's difficult. It's challenging. If it were easy to get out of this mess, somebody would have made a proposal and we could have tried to follow it. But I do think that there's a place in here for something that we haven't seen a lot of recently, which is kind of responsible leadership. I mean, and by that I mean the coming together of people who have different party affiliations to say, look, it's important enough for our country to get this, or for the world to get this right, that we shouldn't invent division. So what should you do about a complicated scientific question? You should find the best scientists
right.
and see what they say. I don't have any special insight into global warming. I have noticed, I'm a gardener, so I've noticed changes in the climate, but I don't have a big theory about why that's happening or about what you should do about it. But there are people who have spent their lives thinking about this, who are qualified. They can recognize each other by their qualifications and by the journals they publish in. Let them decide for us. Let's not.
We don't treat that like we do, say, oncologists. I'm only going to pick a liberal oncologist.
Right. And I think one reason is that if you pick the wrong oncologist, you die.
Yeah, right.
But if you pick the wrong climate scientist, it's only your grandchildren that are going to really suffer, people think. Right. But we're already seeing that that's not true. We're already paying huge costs, the scientists tell me, for this. And so I think there's a role for kind of pulling responsible leadership together and saying, look, you don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican. And we can disagree about what to do about it, and maybe that'll turn out to be partisan because your party's more in favor of letting the business decide by itself and my party's more in favor of regulation. But at least let's agree on some picture of what's going on and on some of the things that need to change in order to make it work. And it's actually not, this is just me talking like someone who believes in regulation, but it's not actually a good idea to encourage companies to make the choice between profits and the environment. It's better to make the rules in such a way that the companies do better if they respect the environment. And the way to do that is to make it illegal or to penalize companies that violate reasonable environmental regulation. So, and corporations will do that. If you give them reasonable regulation, it means that you can't compete with them by violating those principles.
Right.
So they can just take that as the baseline. Now, there are whole industries like coal, which feel that if we were to have more regulation, they would simply have to disappear. Again, I'm not sure that's true. And certainly, if we had gone for example, for some form of cap and some form of trade pollution trade system,
yeah.
We might there would have been incentives for coal companies to clean up their product, and there would have been reasons for going on using coal in the circumstances where it was reasonable to do so, and it would not have led to the end of the coal industry. So I think, but all of these, what sound to me like perfectly sensible thoughts, are ruled out once we have a political climate in which you can't say, wait a minute, let's not make this one of the things we fight about. We have enough things to fight about already.
Right.
Make this one of the ones. I mean, and so I think it's very distressing, but it's a good example, as you say, of the way in which identity can do enormous damage.
So your second C, so creed, country, color, class, culture. So country, this gets tapped into, I think, with the Make America Great Again, or in Brexit. Why should we allow some faceless bureaucrat in some foreign country tell us what we can price our eggs at, or whatever? That's getting back to some kind of primal xenophobia or primal pride in one's nation. And yet, as you point out, the idea of you use the word country, but state, nation, these are different, configurations of language, of geography, where the border happened to be placed 3 centuries ago. The Treaty of Westphalia that started the modern idea of the nation, and yet we had nation states in ancient Egypt. So what are we talking about when we're talking about country?
This is one of the places where I think something that gives the whole book its shape is revealed, which is I think it's easiest to get these things clear if we look at how we got to where we are in terms of the way we think, by looking back to an earlier time when some of the modern configuration of these ideas was put in place. So modern nationalism, which is sort of taken for granted now in the world today, and is a bunch of things, but one of the central ideas is that there's a kind of cultural or spiritual identity that goes with being a German or Chinese or Indian or American, and that those things and that it's people who share that shared spirit, let's say, that should be allowed to run their lives together. That the world is naturally divided into groups of people who share this spirit, and that spirit should be allowed to express itself in political arrangements by putting one nation per country, one people per country, one spirit per country. And this idea is explicit in Hegel,
right,
for example, and already implicit in earlier German figures like Herder and so on.
Is that kind of 19th century blood and soil?
Well, I think that blood and soil is connected with the thought that the spirit and the blood are one.
Yeah.
If you share the blood,
right,
you will share the spirit. And that the people who share the blood are all in one geographical location, and that they have a kind of history embedded in that place.
Right.
Now, all of this is very surprising if you look back historically, because when people articulated this idea, there was hardly anywhere in the world that was at all like that. I mean, when Herder's talking, we have the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that's most of Europe. We have, if you look into the countries that are outside those empires, France or Britain, they're fantastically internally diverse. Until the late 19th century, a third of the people in the French hexagon didn't speak French. They spoke some other language. When I went to college in England, I had a neighbor in college who was English, from the north of England, from Durham, And I couldn't understand a word he said because he spoke with a strong Geordie accent.
Wow.
Well, Geordie's Newcastle, but it was sort of like that. Now, so the idea that what held people in England together was that they all spoke the same language and that they all knew the same folk songs and that they all had the same relationship to Shakespeare, for God's sake, that's preposterous. And yet that's the idea that these people put together. And the same is true, obviously, in Germany. Germany was a whole hodgepodge of distinct things. Prince bishops and the Free State of Frankfurt and the principalities and the king of Prussia and the king of Bavaria, Bavaria Catholic, Prussia Protestant. I mean, the very internally complex Germany, up until the point that the Prussians took an empire of Germans and called it Germany. And not only was it not true, and not only was it not true of most of the major political arrangements in the world, China is still incredibly internally ethnically diverse. India is obviously incredibly diverse in language and traditions and even the color of people's skins. Obviously, the Ottoman Empire was, and so on. So all this diversity, all these places, but it's never actually so guided by this idea. People tried to do what people with political theories do. They try to make true the thing that they already are claiming is true.
That's the lie in your title. I mean, you can't. 1871, Germany's unified, and you can't just say, "Okay, we're all one identity now." It's like, what do you mean?
And also, they're unified, but with lots of German-speaking people outside Germany.
Oh, right.
In many parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and obviously in Austria, but also in the Czech lands and Slovakia and Hungary, there are German speakers. So there isn't a mapping of German speakers into the German state when the Second German Empire is created. So I think, but nevertheless, in the name of this idea, France tries to make everybody in France speak French. Germany tries to make everybody speak, at least, the same kind of German. So Hochdeutsch gets established as the German literate language. In England, with the rise of universal education, a standard dialect is created for the purposes of that. And of course, in all of these places, very often the state is preoccupied with religious uniformity. So not good to be a Huguenot in France, so on, not good to be a Catholic in England. And as a result of this, in the 19th century, there's a huge amount of enforced unification. People are made to speak common languages, and also expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and all that kind of thing. So this idea, which was false, people try to make it true, and the cost is a huge amount of human suffering. So that's the picture. That's sort of our picture of the ideal state, right? That they have this common language and traditions. So, and this is the idea, the only idea we have when we're trying to deal with some of the great problems of the world today. I don't talk about this in the book, but the only language we have for talking about the question of whether there should be one or two nations in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories of Israel, is this language. Well, they're distinct people, so they need distinct states. Well, first of all, there are lots of Arab Israelis and Palestinians come in every one of the Abrahamic sects except Judaism. They come in every kind of Christianity, and they come in different kinds of Islam. So they're not by any means religiously homogeneous. But they're just people who were at a certain point in history living in the Palestinian part of the Ottoman Empire. That's what they have in common. I don't mean that isn't anything. It's something important. But if you're trying to decide what to do in that part of the world, this way of thinking is going to force you into thinking in terms of two peoples, two states, that kind of thing. There's a perfectly obvious alternative picture, right? Which is that here's a bunch of territory which has a boundary around it. Within it, you should have a democratic society in which people, irrespective of their religion and their racial ancestry and whatever you want to say, work together as free citizens to run the state. Now, that violates a principle of Zionism, which is the view that there should be a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. I'm not. I don't have any deep commitment to thinking that that's a bad idea, but it isn't the only possible idea about how to think about that territory. And if you think in these 19th century ways, it will be the only way that will occur to you.
You mean you mean the two-state solution is a derivative of this 19th century idea of every people needs a nation with a border and a wall or troops or something that defends their territory, right? Okay.
Right. And that we know what the peoples are.
Yeah. Oh, right. Clearly defined.
And they're not.
And they're never that way.
The Palestinians are. My main point about most identities is, yes, there's such a thing as being Palestinian, though it has vague boundaries. But no, Palestinians are not all the same. Yes, there's such a thing as being Jewish, but that has vague boundaries too. There's such a thing as being Israeli, but that has vague boundaries, and so on. And they've just voted a resolution in the Knesset to sort of make it more clear that Israel is a Jewish state. But that itself, could go various ways. Britain is an Anglican state.
But back one step. Is this why moving the embassy to Jerusalem was such a big issue, because it's part of that 19th century idea?
It's part of that picture, right? So not only do people have, not only is there a people, but there's a territory, and it has its natural center, right? So the spiritual center of Muslim identity in that part of the world is clearly Jerusalem. Obviously, the spiritual center of Jewish identity in that part of the world is Jerusalem too. It's also one of the holiest cities for Christians. So of course they are all fighting over it.
Right.
Whether it's helpful in the early 21st century to try and settle questions about terrible relations between 2 or 3 communities in that part of the world by appealing to these 19th century pictures is another question. I'm not going to be able to solve the Israeli-Palestinian question, but I hope I can get people to see that some of the ways that people bring to thinking about it are just not helpful.
We've grown accustomed to the taboo against changing national borders, such that when Putin reaches down and redraws a little bit of Crimea, the world goes crazy, although nothing is done to stop him. And yet that used to happen all the time. The borders were constantly changing all the way up until the Second World War. And then after that, it's kind of frozen, and maybe by the 70s.
Yes. Though, again, Eritrea escaped from Ethiopia in the post-1970. There are a number of examples. There's the example in the Indonesian archipelago. But and that's because there are 2 conflicting thoughts here, right? One is the sort of inviolability of the nation state, and the other is the need for people to be able to, peoples defined independently of states, to be able to live in their own state. The Eritreans said, we are not Ethiopians. Well, there are lots of people in Ethiopia who are not Amhara. So I don't know why the Eritreans got to be the ones that were allowed to escape, but anyway, they were. And, if the Eritrean government were better than it actually is, I wouldn't mind so much. But I think it's just not a very helpful picture, I think, for resolving these things. And especially, maybe because I grew up in Ghana. So in Ghana, we have, 70 or 80 languages that are recognized by the government. The government schools teach, I think, 11 of them or something like that. And government goes on in English, but in the courts, you can speak any of these languages. And so there have to be interpreters for all these languages. Significant proportion of the population has English as a first language now, but most people are still people for whom English, which is the government language, is the second language.
I'm reminded of, I'm here in California, I'm reminded of a bumper sticker I saw. Why the hell should I press 2 for English? I don't know what they do in Ghana.
Yeah.
Press 11 for...
Press 11 for press 117. The South Africans have 11 official languages since the end of apartheid. So I think, and the point is, Ghana does perfectly well as a nation without having one language. We've got about a quarter of Ghanaians are Muslim, and about, more than half probably are Christian, and then there are people of other religions. That's fine too. England has survived since the Reformation perfectly well with a large Catholic minority. Didn't need to turn everybody over to Protestantism, and so on. We think of Scotland as a Protestant country, but Glasgow, which is the largest city in Scotland, has a majority Catholic population. So the idea that these things all have to line up, that religion and language and literature all have to line up with your state membership, I think it's an unhelpful idea. And if you push it, it leads to people treating other people very badly, because it leads them to saying, you have to speak. It leads to people in this country who shout at people they hear speaking Spanish, right?
Right.
Now, if you hear somebody speaking Spanish, you have no idea whether they can speak English.
Right.
The vast majority of Hispanics in the United States, the vast majority of Hispanics in the United States can speak English.
Right.
And 99% of them think that their children ought to learn English. It's completely uncontroversial.
Right.
There's no serious Spanish-only movement in the United States among Hispanics. So if you've got a community that for one reason, historical reason or another, wants to speak some language other than English some of the time, but they speak English as well, and then therefore they can answer questions and act as jurors and vote in elections and understand political campaigns, they can participate in our citizenship and have as many languages as they like. So I think that this sort of thing, it's not just that English is the language of the United States, it's that Spanish isn't the language of the United States that these people care about, and that's unhelpful.
So if we took a big picture, could you foresee us, I don't know, in the next 1,000 years returning to something like city-states, and the nation-state idea would just dissolve, mainly because of economic pressures? If we just open the borders, people can trade with whoever they want, travel wherever they want, live wherever they want. You'd be a New Yorker, I'd be a California or Los Angeles or whatever. Since it's fluid and historically relatively new, maybe it could go away.
I mean, I think that in that picture, political units continue to be defined by geography, right?
Oh, right.
And maybe that'll happen.
So maybe you'd still end up with Sparta and Athens, and we'd be in conflict.
Yes. So I think that what I would like to see is, yes, more freedom, more flexibility. I don't think it's wrong for people to limit movement to some extent, just because the modern state, for example, provides services to citizens that it doesn't provide to non-citizens. And if anybody can go anywhere, people are likely to move to the place where the services are best. And while in the long run that may lead to the equalization of services, in the short run it leads to putting pressure on good societies and making them worse. And while it's helping the people who are coming in, it seems to me reasonable for the people who are already there to say, we want to set limits on this.
Right.
But in the long run, if you think that, the basic liberal thought, and here liberal means something that is shared with conservatives in the United States, and liberal in the philosophical sense, the basic liberal thought is that people should be managing their own lives, making the big decisions for themselves, that they shouldn't be made for them by states or churches or parents or anybody like that. Once you're grown up, you get to manage your own life. And I think that one of the big constraints on managing your own life in the world today is that you can't decide freely where you go.
Right.
And so, yes, it would be, I think, preferable to allow people to do that a little bit more freely. I think you have to understand, though, that people are shaped by the communities they grow up in, and that if you have kind of absolute Brownian motion, if you have just people moving wherever they like, you'll get what you get with Brownian motion.
That's a nice metaphor. I like that.
all the gases will mix.
Well, then that leads me to your third C of color, which we've already touched upon. But again, big picture, if people were just free to move around and there weren't any political, legal barriers to interracial marriage, say, for example, more and more people would look like you or Tiger Woods or whatever, and I don't know what you are. And then it becomes less important if I can't identify you.
Yes. So I think that this is happening to some extent. I have a favorite photograph of mine, which I don't have it here, so I can't show it to you, but which is me and my husband and many of my family at my nephew's wedding. Now, my nephew has a Norwegian father, and my sister is his mother, so she's half Ghanaian and half British. He was marrying a Namibian in a village in
Right.
northern Namibia, and we're all dressed in our various costumes. I'm dressed in the cloth that people wear in Asante for weddings, the kente cloth. My Nigerian brother-in-law, another of my brothers-in-law, is there, dressed in the Yoruba configuration. And in the front row are cousins and sisters and people, all dressed differently. Some of them are Norwegian, some of them are British, some of them are Namibian, some of them are Ghanaian, some of them are Nigerian.
Right.
And they're one family.
Right.
The more that that's true in the world, if you want to understand, my nephew's name is Christian Andresen, so you might think frightfully Norwegian. But this guy is he's in the computer business in Namibia. His wife is Namibian. His boy is a cute less than 1 year old is half Namibian and whatever it is, some fraction, a quarter Norwegian and an eighth Ghanaian and an eighth British. The more there are people like that in the world, the less you will know about someone if you say he's Norwegian,
Right.
he's Ghanaian, and so on. And you don't know very much. I mean, there's a lot you don't know now if you say that.
Right.
I'm an American, and Trump's followers in Mississippi are American.
Right.
We're not terribly similar in lots of ways. Though maybe there are some people in Mississippi who are terribly like me, who are
Right.
interracial gay philosophers. I don't know.
Right.
But the more we recognize that these things matter, I don't mean to deny these things matter to people. That's why it says that bind.
Right.
They do matter to people.
They do bind, yeah.
They can lead people to do good things.
Yeah.
In the name of American identity, I'm willing to pay taxes to see people, children fed and educated, healthcare delivered equally to all of us, places protected from crime by police force that I'm willing to pay for, and I'm willing to pay for the federal police as well as the local police, and that means I'm willing to pay for people to be protected by the FBI in Arizona and in Alaska as well as New York City. It would make no sense if I didn't think of them as my fellow citizens. Why would I be sending them money to do all this?
Right. Well, you somehow have to trick the brain into thinking this person is an honorary member of my clan, family, whatever. I call this the Ndugu effect. After that Jack Nicholson film about Schmidt, I don't know if you ever saw that, but so Jack Nicholson plays this retired insurance agent, and they give him the watch, and he's retired, but he still is active, and he's bored, and so late one night he's watching TV, and he comes across one of those infomercials for Adopt a Child in Africa. So he's like, okay, $30 a month, I can, and it's little Ndugu. So here's little Ndugu, here's his name, here's his picture. He plays soccer, he lives in this little hut here, and so on. And so the narrative arc of the film is him writing letters to little Ndugu. And, it's a typical sort of, middle class American narrative story. My motorhome broke down and my daughter's marrying this nincompoop and I can't stand him. And he's going on and on about his life. And, poor little Ndugu can't even read, and he barely has anything to eat or write. And he doesn't find this out until the end of the movie. But there are studies that show, for example, that is effective. I can get you to give $30 a month if I show you one person, but if I show you 10,000 starving children in Kenya or whatever, it just gets right over your head. Too much, can't do it. I can't identify with a group. I can identify with one. So nonprofits have figured this out. I'm not sure corporations or governments have figured it out. How to tap into that evolved psychology of us. We care about our extended family. Maybe 150 people or so is about the extent of our sympathies to extend. Anyway, it's just a thought that occurred to me when.
I mean, I think that it is striking that you can get again, it runs against the kind of myth about identity, that you can get people to bond across what look like enormous identity divides if you just present them to each other as it were one-on-one.
Right.
I can think of people that I know. One of my favorite people growing up was unbelievably different from me in every conceivable way. She's dead now. She was an old lady. She lived to be over 100. She didn't speak any English, which was pretty rare in Ghana. She was very traditional minded. She spoke a beautiful version of Tree, my father's language, which was lovely to listen to. And she was very interested in and preoccupied with the lives of the people she knew about, which was a lot of people because she was a well-connected person. She wasn't at all interested in my life. When I went to see her, she would never say, "Oh, how are things in America?" She would just start talking about the things we normally talk about, which were around her. Now, the only reason she let me into her life was that she was very close to my father, and he was part of her kind of traditional social world. But once I was in, so it just took that one thing. Once I was in,
right.
she loved me, and I loved her.
Right.
And she wasn't literate. I mean, there were lots of things. She was very, very different from me in all kinds of conceivable ways.
So here are liberal sensitivities lean toward travel, reading, the internet, these sorts of things that can override these other identity characteristics that are important, but provisionally important if I actually know you. So one of the explanations for the rapidity, the speed with which the gay rights revolution came about compared to women's rights and civil rights was the exposure on television, films, narrative stories, and so on. Ellen DeGeneres just coming out, so I like this person, and okay, so I can accept them.
Yes. No, I think one of the important tools for dealing with the bad side of identity is remembering that we have, first of all, we have many identities, so that the ones that divide us are only some of them we share. But I think the other thing is what you're talking about, which is that getting to know people, not in order to build bridges and not because you have some theory about identity, just because you're running a little league together for your kids, or you're an opera society in Milan, or you're playing soccer with people in the weekend soccer league in Brooklyn. People who are very, very diverse in the obvious ways can do those things together. And once you know some people of the other kinds through that kind of activity, it's really hard to maintain prejudices against all of their kind.
Right.
You sort of, when people say, as you said in the gay case, I think, when people didn't know they knew gay people, right? Then when you said gay people, they weren't thinking about anybody.
Right.
Or at least not anybody they knew. They were thinking about some strange person maybe, or somebody they'd seen somewhere or heard about.
In West Hollywood, at that parade.
Right, exactly. Which is, off-putting for lots of people. But if you say gay, and I think, oh, that's my friend James.
Right.
That's my friend Jeannie. And then people start saying bad things about you. And then well, no, I'm not going to go along with that.
Right.
And even if people have, as it were, principled reasons for worrying about homosexuality, maybe they're genuinely convinced that it's immoral, they can be friends with gay people if they're given a chance.
Right.
So that there genuinely are people in the United States who are, say, against gay marriage, but have real friendships with gay people. And they would probably go to their weddings, even though they don't approve of them exactly. So I think that and that's one of the good things about people, is that we're not actually rigorously consistent in all our theoretical commitments, that we're able to let things go, right? And make sense of our lives in that way. There's a wonderful episode in a British television program that I used to watch called Skins, which is about kids growing up in Bristol in England, not far from where I spent my time in England as a child. And one of the white kids has a friend who's a Muslim boy of Pakistani ancestry, and the white kid is gay. And his friend knows this, his friend who is straight, his Pakistani friend, and nevertheless, he's a young Brit, so he thinks that's fine. But he knows that his parents will have difficulty, so he won't tell his parents. And his parents are very close to the white kid, too. So one day, the white kid refuses to come into his friend's birthday party because he said, you said you would tell them, and you haven't told them, and I'm sort of fed up with it. So then the father comes out and says, why are you not coming in? And he says, because your son hasn't told you something that I asked him to tell you. I said, well, why didn't you tell me? As he's about to tell him, the son says, he's gay. And the boy says, yes, I'm gay. And the father looks at him and he says, look, I'm a Muslim, and Friday in mosque is the best day of my week. But I don't know everything. And here's what I do know. You're my son's best friend. So please come in. So he doesn't say homosexuality is okay, right? He just says, well, we can muddle through in these circumstances. The most important thing is that you're my son's friend.
So here he's putting in another criteria of identity, friendship, I guess, or member of our immediate circle. That overrides the other one.
Time, right?
Yeah.
And thank God.
Right, so we don't have to have acceptance, at least in the beginning, just not intolerance.
Not intolerance. And then, of course, one thing tends to lead to the other, which is why the people who want to maintain intolerance don't want to move to accept a sort of, mild acceptance.
Now your fourth C, class. This is kind of a new one, I think, particularly with the rise of after the financial meltdown and the 99%ers versus the 1%ers. It feels like this class warfare. Even while poverty is going extinct, as the Gates Foundation tracks closely. We've gone from 90% impoverished a century ago to about 10% impoverished now, as defined by the UN, $2 a day or less.
Globally.
Yeah, globally, yeah. So this is all good news in the long run, and yet there's still this psychology of even if I have a TV and an air conditioner and a microwave and so on, the people around me that I see as my equals have 10 times as much as I do, or the people down in LA that have the big jobs, they have 100 times more than I do. That makes me feel like I'm a lower class. So we have objective measures of wealth, per capita, GDP, whatever. But that seems less important in terms of how you're talking about class identity of the relative comparison across groups.
I think that's so. We're one of the things we are as a species is somewhat prone to hierarchical things. Especially, we like to be above other people in some respect or other. Money is one of them, but it isn't by any means the only one. There are status hierarchies that don't correspond at all to how much money you have. Donald Trump is not terribly high in certain kinds of status hierarchies, though he's one of the richest people in the country, apparently.
People I know in New York real estate say he's way down, wouldn't even get invited to the...
He wouldn't get invited to the big parties.
Right.
And I gather that has upset him, and that may explain some of his behavior.
Yes.
So I'm sorry they didn't invite him to those parties. But so there are these different hierarchies. I wanted to make two central points about class. One is that we live now with a kind of ideology of meritocracy, which is pretty misleading. If Ivy League universities take more of their students from the top 1% of the income distribution than from the bottom 60%, you can't tell me that corresponds to the distribution of talent. It does correspond to the distribution of money and social capital, connections. So I think, and of course the ideology of meritocracy is doing the job of letting the people who are doing very well think that that's fine because they deserve it. And I think I want to question whether that's a good way to think about the distribution. Now, I happen to be, I'm not an egalitarian about money and wealth. I think it's just fine for people to have different amounts of money and wealth. What I am is a sufficientarian in philosopher's jargon. I think everybody should have enough. And then beyond that, I think you should let the market and so on determine. I think there are plenty of people in the United States who don't have enough. If kids are going hungry to bed in the United States, that's wrong, and we should do something.
But
I agree. I don't have any focus on generating a world in which everybody has the same amount of stuff, money or wealth or anything like that. But if you have a society where there's a strong correlation between respect and money, between respect and cultural capital and money, that is education and the things that education brings and money, then what happens is that people who are low in social capital, that is low in connections, low in cultural capital, haven't been to college, and low in financial capital, are cut out of one of the most important things that social life is about, which is respect. Denied respect. Now, I don't think you have to make everybody have the same amount of money to make sure that everybody has respect. As I say, I don't believe that, and I don't care about that, but I do care about respect. I do think that self-respect is good.
And dignity is also another word that sociologists use that has some form of value to people.
Very much so. Yes. And I think it's normatively important. That is, I think that we shouldn't undermine people's dignity. We should try and make social arrangements. I mean, there are bad people, right? There are people who don't deserve respect because they've done bad things. I'm not talking about them. I'm just talking about regular people who aren't very successful in the ways that are currently valued in our society. So they can't make a lot of money. They can't be invited to be on fancy boards and so on, right? Those people, many of them are much harder working than some of the people who've got more stuff. Those people shouldn't be denied the possibility of thinking of themselves as worthwhile people, and that's the real.
So the mistake is that people make is thinking, if I can get up into that class socioeconomically, I will also share the dignity and respect of those people that I think I want, and it doesn't always work out like that.
Well, not only that, but that's the only way in which people think they can get the dignity and self-respect, and that's ridiculous.
Right.
I mean. But once you've got hierarchies, then somebody's going to be at the bottom.
Right.
Somebody's going to be at the top, and somebody's going to be at the bottom. Being at the bottom of some hierarchy, say of wealth, we shouldn't have a society in which people at the bottom of the hierarchy of wealth have to think of themselves as kind of failures and lacking in self-respect.
Right. Well, we've been going for a little over an hour here. I don't want to miss out on the last one, culture. I had to memorize when I took anthropology, the great Tyler's definition, which you quote here in your book. Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society, in that classic 19th century way of writing things, which is pretty much everything else other than the 4 C's that you described before of what is culture. This seems to be the most fluid of all. And I'm thinking of the whole intersectional theory and the sort of what's sometimes called the oppression Olympics in academia, which is the most oppressed group. And culture is all wound up in that. And there's this whole business about cultural appropriation. We had a silly controversy a few years ago in a local university here, Taco Tuesdays. Spanish food in Southern California is pretty big, so Taco Tuesday. But this was a group of white kids, not Hispanic kids, who were holding this Taco Tuesday thing. And so that was a big controversy. It seems like things have gotten really messy in recent years with that issue.
Yeah, and I think one problem with the way we talk about culture is that there's Tyler's notion, which you just read out, which is one notion I think is a perfectly sensible way of dividing up some territory. And then at the same time as Tyler was writing that, Matthew Arnold in Culture and Anarchy was talking about culture in the other sense, in which opera and novels and poems are culture.
So-called high culture.
High culture. Tacos are not culture in Arnold's sense, but they are they are culture in Tyler's sense. And so what I want to say about Tyler about culture in Arnold's sense is that belongs to those who do the work. Shakespeare belongs to the great Indian literary critics who write about Shakespeare, the great Japanese literary critics who write about Shakespeare, just as much as it belongs to Matthew Arnold or Harold Bloom or some great American critic. That's not how those things you get to ship. You get in the only sense in which you can own them is that sense. You can study them and you can commit to making sense of them. There's copyrights and stuff like that as well, but that's not what we're talking about here. In culture, in that sense, appropriation is the game. It's the only thing that works.
It's all appropriation.
It's all appropriation, and a good thing too.
Yeah.
My favorite example here is that you couldn't think of anything more Japanese than Basho, the great haiku master of the 17th century. Narrow road to the teeth knot. Nothing more Japanese than that. But the guy's a Zen Buddhist, which means that his religious tradition comes from India. And he's writing in a script which comes from China.
Right.
And if he had refused the script and refused Zen Buddhism, he wouldn't have been Basho. He wouldn't have been the Japanese person that he was.
Right.
So, and the same is true of Shakespeare's, Shakespeare's prince is a Dane.
Right.
Shouldn't have stolen Danish history. He should have stuck with English princes. And so on. So I think in that domain, I just think it's crazy. And I mean, the other way around. What would jazz be if it weren't allowed instruments developed in Germany?
Right.
Like the pianoforte.
Right.
That's a German piece of instrumentation. Do we really think that jazz musicians should dump the piano on the grounds that it's not black?
Yeah.
And so on. So I think that's crazy. But I think also that people exaggerate the role of that kind of culture in holding together communities.
Right.
So this city that I live in, New York, is not held together by the fact that we all know the novels of Nathaniel Hawthorne or some other great American novelist, or that we are all equipped to make sense of some great American poets like Marianne Moore. Nor are we held together by our shared love of opera, because lots of people in the city don't love opera. They don't even know about it, many of them. But on the other hand, we're not held together by jazz or blues or anything else either. What are we held together by? Well, our capacity to relate to one another in civil ways on the street, which we're very good at. People who don't know New York City have this completely false notion. People in New York are extremely good at being nice to other people, to strangers. It's part of our culture. It's part of our culture, whether we are a recent immigrant from Jamaica or somebody whose ancestors came over, with the Dutch when this was New Amsterdam. So I think.
Well, that's your previous book, Cosmopolitanism.
Yes, right.
I mean, when you see the word, you think New York City.
You do, yes, and other great cities. I mean, I think
of course, right.
So I think the idea that you need high culture to hold ordinary. That was one of these ideas that goes back to people like Herder and Hegel, that I mentioned before. I think it's a mistake. I love these things. I love Basho. I love Shakespeare. I'm not saying that they aren't important. I'm just saying that they aren't important for this.
Right.
They're important for something else. And because they're important for something else, I don't have to say to someone in Ghana, well, I'm not going to waste my time teaching you about Shakespeare because I should be teaching you the great literate and pre-literate traditions of Ashanti and so on. Yes, you should know about those, but nothing wrong with giving you access to Shakespeare and other forms of culture from elsewhere. Now, one of my sort of targets in that chapter is another story about culture, which says, again, in order to divide us from the world of Muslims, that they have this distinct, remote, different culture, and that we can't therefore sort of mix and match with them.
Right.
This is historical nonsense, because at the level of high culture, there were better Aristotelians in Baghdad in the 9th century than anywhere in Western Europe.
Right.
And it's nonsense in other ways, because even though there were great Aristotelians in Baghdad in the 9th century, most Muslims didn't know anything about that.
Right.
So while that was interesting and important, it has nothing to do with any more than most Christians in 16th or 17th century Europe knew anything about St. Augustine,
right,
or the great Christian cultural text. So again, this is part of this idea that high culture is sort of super important in defining identities, which I don't think is right. except among academics and so on, people who care about high culture, and that's where that belongs. It doesn't belong in the general world.
Well, that gets me to this issue. You're a professor at NYU, and I'm a professor at Chapman University here in Southern California. Your colleague Jonathan Haidt has a new book coming out next month, The Coddling of the American Mind, and I share with him some of these concerns about, students are these snowflakes, they can't handle controversy, safe spaces, microaggressions, all these protests at Yale and Berkeley. And if you just watch the evening news, it just seems like, the academy's falling apart. And yet when I go to class and I walk around campus, I don't see anything. I mean, just students doing their thing. And I imagine that's the same for you at NYU. 99% of the time, nothing's happening. So I can't decide if we're approaching a crisis or this is just much ado about nothing.
I mean, the bad episodes that people like John talk about are bad episodes. I grant you that. I grant him that, and I agree with him about that. But the question of how representative they are of what's going on, I think, is one where I agree with you that it doesn't seem to me so clear, just from my own experience. And remember, I teach about identity all the time. I've written books about identity. I've written about blackness. I've written about Africa and so on. These, you might think that it would come up in my classes if it were going to come up as a problem. So I don't know. I mean, I do think that there's an industry among administrators of worrying about things that I'd be more relaxed about than they seem to be. Look, but here's my bottom line. In universities, the guiding project is understanding. And if getting to understanding involves a bit of pain, that's the price we need to pay. We don't need to institutionalize pain or insist on unnecessary pain. But if we have to talk about difficult things in order to get understanding of things worth understanding, we should talk about difficult things. You can't teach criminal law if you're not allowed to talk about rape. Rape is a difficult topic. It's a difficult thing to think about. It's painful. It's painful, frankly, whether you've been raped or not. But of course, it's especially painful if you have been. But you can't have sensible investigations and teaching and thought about criminal law if you can't talk about rape. And similarly, you can't have sensible discussions of laws that, for example, add penalties to assaults where the motive is racial hatred. You can't discuss those things unless you're allowed to discuss episodes in which racial hatred is expressed.
Right.
John had a horrible experience because he mentioned a gay person. He didn't say anything at all anti-gay. He just mentioned a gay person in a way that some gay student didn't like. We can't have that. I mean, I don't know enough about the details of that particular case, and John will tell you about it if you ask him. But my point is that if that's what happened, it shouldn't have happened.
Right.
Because we have to be able to talk about these things. Now, of course, I always say to students when I'm teaching about identity, look, we run the risk of upsetting each other, so let's try not to.
Right.
Let's not be insensitive.
Right.
And if somebody does upset you, let's think about how we're going to handle it. Let's agree that might be an occasion for us to learn something. Right. Because they probably didn't mean it. So how did someone who didn't mean to upset you about some identity issue come to do so? These are all things we're discussing. But let's not shut up. Let's not say things because we're worried that that'll happen. Provided we're trying to be polite. I mean, I'm perfectly capable of enforcing civility in a classroom. I don't think that violates any principle of free speech, that you have to express yourself in a way that's respectful of the other people in the room. But the fact that somebody in the room takes offense doesn't mean you've done something wrong. Right. It's happened. It's worth thinking about what it is, but it doesn't mean that they've done something wrong. If they were trying to express a view and they've upset you, it's an interesting thing. Now, another thing I say often is, look, when we're upset, we don't think well. Right. So it may not be the right moment to bring it up, the moment when you're really upset. Maybe you should come to me or to them and work out a way of us bringing it back to the class when we're all less upset.
Timing's important, yes.
So there are lots of things that might go wrong, and there are lots of things you can do about them. But what you can't do is stop talking. I don't mind people having safe spaces that aren't classrooms. I don't care what people do in other spaces. You shouldn't. It's impolite to shout Allahu Akbar in a Catholic church, right?
Right.
Perfectly free to say it in other contexts, but in the Catholic Church, it's a safe space for Catholics. They're allowed to expect that other people will behave in ways that conform to Catholic tradition. Yeah. But my classroom is not in that sense a safe space. It's safe for ideas that are relevant to the thing we're trying to understand. That's how I think about it.
Right. That sounds good. Right. Well, Kwame, we've been going for almost an hour and a half. Your book is great. I would remind our listeners that you're also a weekly columnist for the New York Times. You write the Ethicist column, and I have to tell you, I have a background in psychology, and I've written a couple of books on morals and philosophy, and I'm always amazed that you come up with the right answer, at least what seems to me the right answer, when I can't think of it. Like the latest one was somebody wrote and said that one of their clients has a drinking problem or something. What should I do? I can never think of I don't know what to tell this guy. Just ignore it or not. You seem to kind of integrate utilitarianism, deontology, some virtue ethics, in a way that I think is very clever. You could do this or you could try that. You must face this every week because these are hard problems.
When I was first asked to do this, it was a little bit puzzled because I wasn't sure that my bag of tricks, which is the bag of tricks of a trained moral philosopher, was going to be useful. But as you say, there are these tools in our bag of tricks, as people who know philosophical traditions, that I think do allow people to direct their attention to the features of the situation that are relevant to deciding what to do. And often what's gone wrong is that people have missed out some dimension of the situation that in my bag of tricks you have to go through to make sure that you've considered the right things. A lot of for the last few years I've been teaching a global ethics course, and one of the things we do in that course is read some Confucian stuff. And the thing that I've learned from reading that, and that I've very much taken on board, is how important our relationships are in defining our obligations. I mean, it sounds obvious, and there are lots of moments in the history of philosophy in the Western tradition where this point is made. I'm not saying it's never been made in the West, but it's absolutely central to the way Confucians think. And very often my way of sort of parsing my way through the problems people have is thinking, well, this is your brother, or this is your friend, or this is your colleague, and those are the things about the situation that seem relevant.
Like the latest one, for example, you sort of parsed it between, well, if the client is drinking but they're not hurting anybody, or at least you don't know if they're hurting anybody, it's sort of a utilitarian argument. You might lose your business, so you shouldn't just say anything. On the other hand, if it looks like there might be some harm done, then maybe you should say something to the spouse so that can be an intervention. So there you're kind of balancing utilitarianism and maybe duty ethics there without calling it that.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm not trying to teach people the language of philosophers. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, but you must. But in your bag of tricks, I mean, you must have 100 letters for every one that you publish. So you must have a set now in your head, like, oh, that's number 7 problem, or.
I try. I mean, until recently, I've answered every question that the editor sends to me. So, except one, which was too long for me to figure out how to answer it in a reasonable amount of space. But I've been doing it a while now, and I'm beginning to feel that while my instinctive response might be helpful, it's pretty close to something I've already said.
I see. Right.
But on the other hand, there are new readers coming along, and not everybody's read every column. So I'm trying very hard to continue to answer the questions that come in, and trying not always, even if I think it's basically the same as question 72, I'm trying to think, what can I say? This time I need to say something different.
Well, it's a good exercise because it's not just theoretical. It's not like the trolley problem where we're having a thought experiment. You have people with real world problems.
Yes. And it would be evidence that our philosophical traditions had something wrong with them if they couldn't be brought to bear.
Right. On real problems,
Because Aristotle correctly said that. Well, Kant says that morality is practical. It's about, in the end, it's about
Right.
doing and feeling things. It's not theoretical in the sense of just trying to find out what the truth is. It's about action as well as thought.
Well, congratulations on your new book. What's next on the docket?
Well, actually, over the next year or so, I hope to finish a book that's about early theorists of religion, in which Tyler plays a very big...
Yes, I heard you gave a lecture somewhere at Princeton, I think, on that. I was following that yesterday. It's very interesting. That's a very interesting history. You didn't get to Freud yet. I guess you're probably working your way up into the 20th century.
I'm reading Freud right now, thinking about Freud. And he's,
but you did touch on some of the evolutionary arguments, which I think are important.
Yes. The last chapter will definitely be about some of the evolutionary psychologists and their very interesting ideas. And in a way, what I'm arguing there is that the notion of religion that they're bringing to bear is very much shaped by Tyler and Durkheim and Weber and Freud.
Right.
And that while what they're saying is new, it's not the same as what those guys were saying. Their notion of religion is actually pretty recognizably consistent with that tradition that goes back to Tyler. So, but I agree. I'm very interested in the evolutionary psychology of religion, what they say about it.
Well, we'll have a conversation on that because we have to discuss the new atheism and all the activism because there's the scholarly end. Part of me is very interested in that. Scientific explanation for the origins of religion. Then there's the activist part of me that says, well, we have to get rid of parts of religion that are dangerous and harmful to people, and that's a different question.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think the main point that I would add into that discussion is the point that I made when we were talking about religion, which is that when you're thinking about actual religious identities, you shouldn't focus solely on the propositions.
Right. Yeah, that's right. What people do is what really matters.
Right.
Well, thank you for your time.